Welcome back to Taller Together, the podcast from Armature, where we explore the systems, structures, and unseen mechanisms that shape the art world. I'm your host, Tamzin Lovell, and today we're diving into a deeper currents of power, not the flashy kind, but the quiet, structural power that determines which artworks matter, which institutions act, and what stories get told. Our guest is someone who has spent his career at the fault lines between culture, crime, and authority. Dr. Noah Charney, art historian, cultural criminologist, author of numerous books on art crime, and founder of ARCA, the Association for Research into Crime Against Art. What Noah's work makes clear is this: art crime isn't just about theft, it's a map of power. Who holds it, who lacks it, and how cultural influence moves beneath the surface. Today, we're unpacking those hidden infrastructures of power through the cases, patterns, and surprising realities that Noah has spent decades studying. Welcome, Noah. It's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much. When you said I spent decades studying it, I was just thinking, my goodness, I must be very old, because when I first got started, everyone sort of thought that I was already old, and then I was surprised when I was 20-something and going all these conferences, and now I actually am old, so I've caught up with the expectations.
Yeah, yes, indeed. You did start young, and you made a real mark really quickly by entering into a territory that was a gap. Nobody was doing it, and it was so important. So as soon as you started to be the voice, people went, oh, wow. So that was a fantastic entry into the academic market.
It was really the case back then. I remember when I was just starting my postgraduate studies, and I was trying to think, am I going to study what I thought I wanted to do, which was iconography of 16th century Italian painting, which 32 people and my mother would have read my book. That would have been fine. That's the traditional academic path. Or I got interested in art crime, which was relatively barren territory. And I very quickly read all the books I could find that were on the subject, and they could fit on one modest bookshelf. And it was the very lack of material on it that felt like it had been an overlooked field of study that got me excited about it. Because as you said, it was something that any contribution one made at that period was noteworthy because there was relatively little out there.
Yes, and you've since filled the bookshelf with your own books. You've written extensively.
I think my 30th book comes out this winter, which sounds like a lot.
Absolutely amazing. So let's start at the highest altitude, if you like. Your work sits across law enforcement, museums, criminals, histories, governments, a very complex ecosystem. In your research, who actually holds power in the art world and who only appears to?
This is a good question, and the answer is complicated. Who appears to hold power are gallerists and the big four auction houses, but particularly Sotheby's and Christie's. They are the way that people buy the very highest end art. To demonstrate this, even art that would have not interested these institutions of the art world at all. I'm thinking of NFTs, for example, when there was a 2-year window where NFTs were much talked about, that even they were sold by Christie's and Sotheby's. And so when you want to get serious about selling works for high value, then there's a small handful of galleries, and then Christie's, Sotheby's, and then to a lesser extent, Phillips and Bonhams. Who actually holds the power are art collectors, buyers. The problem is that they are diffused. My colleague, who's the art critic for New York Magazine, Jerry Saltz, once said he thinks there are only about 1,500 proper art collector players in the world, which is a tiny number globally. I'm not sure about the number exactly, but that sounds roughly right. And they're the ones who really hold the power, but because they're in competition with each other, who acquire pieces in many cases, they aren't representing a sort of core of solidarity that could insist on things that the market could do differently and better. For example, requiring recent objective forensic test results, or these days AI image analyses of artwork worth over, let's say, 100,000 that you might want to sell. Collectively, buyers could insist on that, And it would not be an unreasonable expectation that they would feel more reassured that what they're buying is what they think they're buying. Because they're diffused, because it's around the world, because they're often in competition with each other, they haven't harnessed the power they actually have by acting as a single unit and demanding things that would be to their benefit.
Interesting. That brings us to a pattern that you've written about, the idea that art crime reveals power shifts long before the headlines catch up. You were talking about the way that power could shift by those that are truly powerful, but there's also a kind of political power that can be revealed through art crime before the headlines catch up. Are there any recent art crime cases that reveal shifts in cultural or geopolitical power?
There have certainly been historical ones. I hosted a BBC Radio 4 series called China's Stolen Treasures. That is one example. So that was looking at a series of thefts from European museums over a course of about 10 years from a number of different countries, mostly in the UK, of Chinese imperial art that had gone missing during the Second Opium War. The idea being that it had probably been looted by British or French troops and brought to Europe. And it was a question of whether it was being proactively stolen back by or on behalf of China as a state or by some actor within China. And it was an interesting idea because there's this concept of cultural heritage objects, artworks, monuments, as the rope in a tug of war between political movements or parties or countries. So in this case, China was occupied by hostile forces. The Summer Palace was completely destroyed. Much was looted from it, but there were objects that were probably taken out of the Summer Palace before the troops arrived that were categorized more broadly as likely having been looted by the Europeans. And then all of a sudden, these very objects being targeted and stolen from European museums, not being offered on any market that at least we're aware of, and quite possibly being smuggled back to China. And so the question is this, a power move from someone in China, but the state be involved? There was no evidence that the state was involved at all, but I can understand why people wondered that. And at the time that the objects were taken, those that were taken by the occupying forces, that was also a power move. So one of the things that I've seen through the study of the history of art crime is the cultural monuments that are taken from a conquered people is a visual way of showing their subjugation. So in ancient Rome, they did this. They would parade chieftains of conquered barbarian tribes, as they would have called it, as well as treasures. So when Titus, before he was emperor, when the son of Emperor Vespasian, when he effectively won the Jewish war, he brought back treasures that had been looted from the temple in Jerusalem, and they were part of this triumphal entry back into Rome. And then they were set up as a museum, a war loot museum, demonstrating all the greatest creations that the conquered people were unable to retain control over. And it was symbolic of the fact that they had been vanquished. We see it also with the Ghent altarpiece, which I have a book on, which is the most frequently stolen artwork in history. Any opposing force that passed through Flanders, what's today Belgium, they would grab the Ghent altarpiece because it was like a battle flag. So we see that certainly at national levels. We can also see it in some cases with individual crimes, like in 1911 when the Mona Lisa was stolen by Vincenzo Perugia and it was missing for 2 years. Effectively, the political left in France used it as an opportunity to make fun of the political right wing that was in power, to say, look how in disarray you are, you can't even protect the most valuable things in France. And then with the more recent Louvre theft jewelry earlier this fall, you see a lighter version of it. People sort of like to take it as an opportunity to make fun of the elites, as I think many people would think of it, and of the administration in power. If there's some sort of wonky incident where they're unable to protect what they should be protecting, it's seen as a chance to make a point about how inept they are.
Yes, it's so interesting. You've noted previously that institutions also respond very differently to different crimes, and not always in ways that align with that cultural value. I guess this sense of a battle flag might explain it to some extent, but why are some thefts pursued aggressively while others sort of quietly fade from institutional attention?
You have to ask it from a number of perspectives. So most people don't realize how much art theft is happening all the time, year after year. The general public tends to think of it in terms of a few high-profile cinematic museum thefts each year, because those are the only ones that make enough headlines that the general public is aware of them. But in fact, there's tens of thousands of reported art thefts every year. In Italy alone, there's usually between around 10 and 20,000. And many more go unreported. What we know about is just the tip of the iceberg. And there are reasons why they go unreported. To your point, institutions are sometimes unaware that they've been burgled, especially if the theft has come out of an archive or storage facility. Then some institutions or private individuals are basically shy to admit that they've been burgled because they don't want to get the bad publicity. They don't want to make it evident that they are insufficiently secure. And sometimes this is for financial reasons. Sometimes it's because, as I'm sure your listeners may know already, most museums around the world don't own all the objects that they display. They'll own some of them, but many of them are owned privately and are on long-term or indefinite loan from their owners. And their owners will not be comfortable with objects being displayed there if they think the place is unsafe. And so you could very quickly have much of the content of major museums recalled and leaving the walls if it was clear that those museums were unsafe. With private collectors, there are sometimes tax or inheritance related issues that make it so they don't want to advertise their ownership of certain objects or where they are, in which case it means they don't want to file a police report if those objects go missing. So there's lots of different reasons why some works of art, if they're stolen, either people wouldn't be aware of it or they wouldn't make it public or even report it to the police. If we were to keep track of all of them, there would be at least dozens a day, probably more than that, and many more that we're unaware of. If you look at the Interpol stolen works of art reports, that's just this sort of miraculous fraction that have made it of the reporting ladder and are present at the highest level. But if we think about it this way, so each theft of an artwork at a local level has to be reported and filed properly by local police, who rarely, in most countries, there's no distinction within the police filing system for cultural heritage objects or art. It's all stolen property. And many police will have their own, button click for auto theft. They'll have a button for, things that's more mundane like cigarette smuggling, but they don't have a special button that distinguishes cultural heritage objects or fine art from stolen property. So things tend to get stuffed into the general stolen property category, but then of course, like a TV is very different from a Rembrandt painting, but they're all stuffed in the same category at a local data entry level. And so someone at that local level has to recognize that, this Rembrandt painting that was reported stolen is a different species than all the other stolen property, and it has to report it up the ladder and file it as such. And it has to go from local to regional, and from regional to national, and then from national to international, which is Interpol, which is this data connection coordination network for international police forces. And there's a lot of places for objects to basically not be filed properly. So what actually makes it to the Interpol stolen works of art, a registry, is just a fraction, one can imagine, of what's actually happening.
Yes, and that kind of administrative geography there, it's complex and opaque, I would imagine, and flawed. But let's talk about geography a little bit. You spent some time mapping regional patterns over decades. Are there parts of the world where art crime now reflects new centers or influence or instability?
There's a couple ways to look at this, and you have to map it in two different terms and then think about source countries versus market countries. So the first part is you have to think about times of conflict versus peacetime. During times of peace, it doesn't mean that crime doesn't happen, obviously. It does happen all the time, but there are laws in place. There are police expected to react to reports. It's less chaotic and more likely that something will be investigated and less likely that people will look for crimes of opportunity because they will anticipate that there will be potential repercussions and investigations. If there's a conflict, so a time of war or political upheaval, then essentially all of the inhibitions that the legal system and the policing system maintain go out the window because it's not certain what the government will do if the same government is going to be in power, if there will be a police response, if the police are too busy with other things. And so you see many more crimes of opportunity from people who would never think of themselves as criminals. You also see proactive targeting on the part of criminal groups. So, for example, in the Baghdad Museum during the Iraqi conflict, there were crimes of opportunity stealing treasures from that museum, but there were also targeted groups that went into the storage facilities and pulled things out of them that was seemingly premeditated and targeted and coordinated in a way that somebody seeing, exploded museum wall and smashed vitrines with objects that they know are valuable lying around, and they grab one. That's a very different sort of act. So we can see it in those two different, it's not time periods, but periods of basically anarchic periods versus, I wanted to say archic, but that's not a word. I just made it up. Times when everything is as it should be. So that's one thing. Then if we look at source countries versus market countries, the number of thefts in market countries, so these are, I don't like the term, but they're basically first world countries where buyers of cultural heritage are generally located. They tend to have a fairly consistent and not remarkably high number of reported art thefts. And in most European countries and in the US, for instance, it's usually around 600 to 1,000 per year. And then we have Italy, which has 10,000 to 20,000, but that's a potentially misleading statistic. And I'll get back to the point that I was making before, but just to finish this thought, one of the reasons why Italy has so many more is not only because it is both a source country and a market country. So it's a source country because it's been a geography with civilization dating back thousands of years, creating plastic artifacts that you can collect and sell. But also it has enough wealth that there are buyers there who are collecting it. But the main thing is they have more than 300 full-time art police agents with the Carabinieri TPC division of their military police. And that is by far the largest art police in the world. Most countries have no dedicated art police at all. So it doesn't necessarily mean that art crime happens 10 to 20 times more per year in Italy than anywhere else. It just means that they are more aware of it because they have 100 to 300 times more full-time police agents who are focused on it. So there may be a similar amount of art crime going on in other countries. It's just people aren't aware because they don't have the manpower dedicated to it. So just circling back, we have source countries and market countries. Market countries are places like the US and England, Singapore, Japan, the Netherlands. These are places with a concentration of wealth and buyers, and it's where some of the biggest auctions or sales will take place. And it doesn't mean that they don't have their own cultural heritage, but there is less specifically in terms of unexcavated archaeological material. Why do I say that? Because when we think of art theft, we tend to think of the theft of objects that are already in collections. But the vast majority of art crime, and this is not an official statistic, but I'm going to say it's something like 80%, involves the illicit looting of antiquities from unexcavated archaeological sites. And just to put this in perspective, when I was at Cambridge, I had a colleague, Sarah Parkak, who's now a celebrity speaker and television personality. She's a professor of Egyptology. And her dissertation was on using satellite maps, and this is a long time ago now, so before it was common to use them to identify unexcavated archaeological sites in Egypt. In Egypt, we feel like we've been over quite thoroughly. It's been excavated for 200 plus years. And she found that of all the known archaeological sites, only about 1% in Egypt has been excavated. She was finding many new sites each day with these satellites that have not been excavated yet. And if Egypt, which has indeed been excavated more thoroughly than most source countries, if there's only 1%, then you can imagine what else is out there. So the biggest problem is with local tomb raiders who are not slowed down by bureaucracy, which proper archaeologists are, and they are able to go out on the weekend and they're not held back by needing to document every step of the way, and they're smash their way into tombs and whatnot and steal things from them without keeping track of anything, without worrying about damaging things in the process, without getting permissions. And because these sites are usually remote, there are too many of them to have them secured. In some cases, they might be alarmed, but they're far enough away from centers of law enforcement that by the time that somebody gets there to respond, it's probably too late. And it's essentially like an open field for people who are looting these objects. And then when the objects come out of the earth, they've never been seen by modern humans. So no one knows what to look for. There's no registry of them to check against if you see them up for sale. And as a result, they can be sold on the open market with forged provenance. So with forged documentation suggesting that they were legally excavated and exported prior to 1970. And that's important because in 1970, UNESCO made a convention that basically said, we understand that national laws about the exportation and sale abroad and excavation of cultural heritage objects on a country by country basis have varied and been erratically enforced. So they basically, in that year, gave an amnesty to things that were excavated and exported prior to 1970 and said, from this point on, we're going to get serious and you need very specific paperwork, and we're going to try to ensure that cultural heritage doesn't leave its origin country. And the result is that lots of antiquities suddenly got paperwork that dated to before 1970 so that they were effectively exempt from this. So if you have forged documents that suggest that it was exported and excavated before 1970, then you have a freer hand in trying to sell it. So you can sell that on open markets with forged provenance, or you can sell it on gray markets, something like an online auction website, and hope to find a buyer. And this is much easier to profit from than the theft of objects from extant collections that are registered, that will be photographed, and police can get photographs and know what to search for. So this is the very long and windy answer to your question, I'm afraid.
It's fascinating, and I think a lot more prevalent, a lot more complex than most people think about. And we think about the movies of kind of tomb raiders and dramatic theft from museums, and like you say, they seem few and far between and very brave. But in fact, there's so much of it going on that we don't even know about, that people are just getting away with, which is really sad. And you've given us a strong frame for understanding how that kind of power moves globally between the source countries and the market countries. So let's think now about technology, because it's reshaping all the links in the cultural chain. How is technology changing the balance of power between criminals and institutions?
It certainly is, but maybe in ways that might surprise people, and it's in some ways less effective than it seems. So we have to think about which fields we're looking at. We can look at it in terms of security studies, museum securities and private institutions, and also in terms of foiling forgers. And I look at both. I'm a professor of the history of art crime, so I have the art theft side, which we've talked about primarily, and I also work on art forgery. So maybe the forgery one is a little bit more straightforward and easier to wrap our heads around, so I'll do that briefly. So in terms of art forgery, you'd think that technology would make it easier for forgers. And for some things it does, especially the forgeries of things that are meant to look like prints, especially 20th century prints. If you see a lithograph by some of the big names of the 20th century, like Dali, Chagall, Miro, Picasso, Modigliani, you have to be very suspicious, because a really good scan and printout that is nicely matted and framed with a little signature added in pencil, that's very easy to do with even the technology dating back to the late 90s. And so there are a lot of forgeries of mid-20th century lithographs, and people tend not to look too hard at them because in art terms, they don't cost very much. You can get these for $5,000, $10,000, which for a normal person is a lot of money, but in art terms, it's so little that people don't really bother looking too hard at it. And so we have cases of vast quantities of these forgeries being churned out because it's so easy to do so and doesn't require any skills. There's no artistry involved. It's just a mechanical process. For forgeries of unique objects like sculptures and paintings, the technology isn't as helpful as you might think. There are 3D printing capabilities of things like statues, but you have to be very naive to be fooled by them. What we see more is technology helping to identify authorship and making it harder for forgers to create something that passes anything more than superficial inspection. So in my book, The Art of Forgery, which came out in 2015, and I actually just finished a new edition of it that'll come out this year, and I had to add a whole chapter, about 10,000 words, on digital advances that back in 2015 weren't really part of the picture. And one of the things that is still the case and was the case then is that the art market tends not to turn to forensic investigation even when it should. And this is just a quirk of the psychology and sociology of the art trade. But since the time of ancient Rome, literally, people tended to rely on the word of so-called, often self-proclaimed experts, and that was supposed to be good enough. An expert would say, I'm a specialist in, I don't know, Michelangelo sculpture, and this is by Michelangelo, and this one isn't. And their word could change the value of something. In today's terms, it can have millions in the balance in terms of differences in value.
Yeah, and that is still very much in play.
Absolutely. It's still the default through the art trade worldwide. Since World War II, provenance research has become the second, I'm going to call it leg of a chair, because I have this little analogy that I'm building here. So the first leg is connoisseurship or expert opinion. The second leg is provenance research. Provenance is the documented history of an object. And that rose after World War II because by some estimates, around 5 million cultural heritage objects changed hands illegally or inappropriately. And there was concern on the part of the art trade that these objects would, I like to think that the art trade was being highly moral. I think it probably is more to do with the fact that they didn't want to deal with the legal complications if a family from which the object was taken were to claim it later on. So there was a real focus after World War II on making sure that the paperwork is in order and basically that there are no blanks during wars that would suggest that maybe the object was stolen or appropriated and a family might claim it later and be able to retrieve it, and then whatever deal in the art market involved the work would no longer be valid. Those are the two legs. The third leg is forensic material science, and this is what conservators do in labs. And this can be, well, it's a little bit invasive sometimes depending on the test. It can be expensive depending on how many tests and the extent that you want, but the trickier part is you need to get the object to a lab. And that has been an inhibitor for some people, but also the market has not demanded that sellers provide forensic tests results. I feel like they should. It would be logical to do so. But there's this power dynamic. We're talking about power within the art market. And if we're going back historically, prior to the 18th century, most of the art, and I'm talking about the European tradition because that's what I'm most familiar with, was in the hands of aristocracy and high-end clergy, so wealthy, influential people. The general public tended to associate the collection of art with people like that. So you have to be wealthy and powerful and erudite. That's good because it meant that people who collected art had some of that magic dust rub off on them. But what it means later on is when we get to the 18th century. We get to the late 18th century with the French Revolution, the sale of the collection of the Duc d'Orléans, which is the first aristocratic wholesale art collection of note since King Charles was beheaded in England and his collection was dispersed. And it launches a trend where basically we have the feudal system has come to an end because of the Industrial Revolution. Aristocrats are no longer able to just sort of live the way they used to, sitting around at home, going hunting, going to war, and otherwise having serfs do all the work for them. And they are wanting to maintain their lifestyle. They don't want to have to go to work. So they're selling off the trappings of their aristocracy to this new mercantile or industrialist class of people who have lots of money but don't have blue blood. And so there's an idea that if I buy an artwork that the Duc d'Orléans used to have in his living room, I'm showing that I'm as classy as he is, and that I'm aristocratic in nature, if not by birth, and that I'm erudite and wealthy, and I can now buy this thing that he has to sell because I have more money than he does. And that's the kind of dynamic there. Built in with this is when Sotheby's first and then Christie's were established in the 18th century to cater to the aristocrats who are having to sell off their art. And there's a reason, you probably noticed this, that even today, you do not have to say who the owner of an object coming up for sale at auction is. It usually says in Christie's or Sotheby's catalogs, property of a lady or property of a gentleman. And unless it's a celebrity, like, I don't know, Yves Saint Laurent or Mick Jagger or something, where part of the appeal is you're buying something that was part of a famous person's collection, then you don't know who the owner is. And there's a reason for that. Back in the 18th century, today, gentleman and lady means a man or a woman, but back then it meant an aristocratic man or an aristocratic woman whose name was not involved because they didn't want to advertise their financial straits that led them to have to sell their collection. So we get this development of new money in the form of industrialists and merchants, if we go back far enough, or today it might be like a crypto billionaire who likes the vibe associated with collecting fine art through these historical institutions. But there's a real classism present, especially in Europe. And the longer your family has had money, the sort of fancier you sound. And we know that sounds silly logically, but you probably can have a sense that that's still the case. And there's an idea of basically not to rock the boat. If you're buying into this world of aristocracy and fanciness, you don't want to be gauche and insist on, forensic test results. I'm not going to buy this painting for $10 million unless I see forensic test results or AI image analysis that confirms what you experts have claimed about who the author is. There has not been an insistence on the part of buyers to do that.
No, the buyer wants to fit in, and it doesn't serve the seller either. So,
well, here's the thing. I would say it doesn't serve the seller if the seller isn't sure that they got it right. Because the danger with testing is I might say, this looks like a Rembrandt and it's going to be really valuable if it is. And then you test it and it turns out it's not. But what I would say is to spin it the other way. This is how I think the future trend, or at least I hope it is, that the trade will see benefits in reassuring the public, the buyers, that what they have is what they say they do, by effectively doubling down and saying, our experts think this is by Rembrandt, let's say, and we tested it and the tests confirm it. And that is as ironclad as you can get these days. So the third leg of this chair analogy is testing, which is very good at authentication, but not as good at attribution. And let me just define that. And then I'm going to circle back to answer your question from a security standpoint with technology. So forensic testing is good at determining the approximate age of a work of art and where the materials came from that made it. And so you can suggest, okay, if this is supposed to be a Rembrandt painting, is it from the right century and the right part of the world? And that has to do with authentication. But it could be from the right time period and location where Rembrandt was working, but by someone who had a studio across the street from him or by one of his assistants. And that's where this fourth leg that's very new and very exciting comes in. And that fourth leg is AI image analysis. And that is very new. It's not at all ubiquitously applied yet, but there's some really interesting case studies. And I've actually started working just this year with a company called Art Recognition based in Zurich that, in my opinion, is the leading firm in this field because I was so impressed with what they were doing. And together we've done some investigations. I started a podcast called Is It? The Art Mystery Podcast, where we test paintings and invite art experts and then reveal the results of the AI image analysis and discuss it with the experts on the show. And I'm doing a book on it as well. So the idea with AI image analysis, the AI is trained in a closed data set, beginning with the catalog raisonné of the artist in question, and then fleshing it out with counterexamples, examples of AI-generated derivative images in the style of the artist and known forgeries and copies. And then the AI is very good at taking all of that information in a catalog raisonné that came from human researchers and putting it to use by examining a high-resolution digital image of the object. They don't actually need the object present. And it takes away the expense of shipping. It takes away the logistics of getting it to a lab, insuring it and whatnot. It's quicker and it's much more cost-effective. And what it gives you is a probability that a certain artist created a work of art or parts of it with a heat map. And that is good at attribution. Attribution asks the question, who made this? Authentication asks the question, is this of the correct period and time to be authentic to the time in which the artist was living, but not saying who made it. So that's the art identification, anti-forgery side of technology that has me most excited at the moment. Just very briefly to finish your question, because I know I'm going on a monologue here. With the security side in museums, the main issue is how are humans responding to the alarms that are the primary defensive tool of art collections. And while alarm systems have gotten more sophisticated, which is good, and there's the ability to track works of art in ways that was never conceivable before, and that's even better, it's still hard to keep the object in the collection building. And that has to do with humans and their response time being sort of the weakest link in the chain. The technology is usually much better at notifying people than they are at responding to it.
Absolutely. The human response is so important.
The reason I mentioned that is, for example, the sort of things that your company does. It's amazing technology, but my first question is, are the local police where this is installed or the security staff at the institution where it's installed, I would like to know how they're trained to respond to these amazing, alarms and motion sensors and trackers. Because once the art leaves the premises, that's already problematic. And police response time in a city on a good day without traffic is maybe 3 minutes after alarm goes off. That's if you're lucky. And so we see trends in thefts. I categorize thefts in different ways. One is a stealth theft where your goal is not to be detected. Technology today makes that very hard to do. But there's a type of theft that I call a blitz theft, borrowing the term from American football, where everybody drops everything and rushes at the quarterback and tries to grab the ball. And these are thefts usually perpetrated by members of organized crime groups. They're usually involving the threat of using weapons that is never actually fulfilled. And armed, masked thieves burst into a building, shout everyone to the ground, grab things that are near the exit, and run out. And they don't care if they've set off the alarms, because they've come in and out much faster than anyone can respond to. And that's where it's sort of the Alexander and the Gordian knot approach, if you know that story, where the town of Gordos had this incredible rope knot closing the gate. And they would open the gates for you if you could undo the knot. It was like this amazing puzzle. And there's this legendary story of Alexander the Great going up to the Gordian knot and looking at it and studying it for a second, and seeing that it would take him forever and would be impossible for him to untangle it. And so he just takes out his sword and he chops the rope in half, and then he takes over the city.
But you're absolutely right. The human response is, of course, the weakest link. And what we do is train extensively, but also have a whole period of trial with fake artworks or test artworks before a system goes live. And we role play with thefts and all sorts of scenarios. So within the building, the staff are trained extremely well. But as you say, as soon as the artwork if it has managed to leave the building, and hopefully you manage to, with the system and the response to the system, you stop it from happening. But once it leaves the building, it's incredibly difficult. It melds into the city and into the underground so fast. It's incredibly difficult.
So glad to hear, Tamzin, that you do that training as part of it, because that's a rarity. That speaks very well to you and the company. Because what I hear more often is museums buying the technology, having it set up, and then they don't quite know what to do with it or how to respond to it. And there's no component of the training. And what you're doing, which is called red teaming, where you're running tests to make sure that people are on their toes, they know how to respond. The best museums do this throughout the year to keep their team on their toes, because museum security is a situation where you might have a 20-year career at a museum and there's never a single incident. So your natural brain approach would be to switch off and expect nothing. So that really speaks well to what you do, because most security systems don't include that. And then the technology may be good, but the response isn't. So well done in including that in your package.
Thank you so much. It is so important. We have kind of 4 layers of that we have to get sign off before a system goes live. After the technology is signed off, it's the human change management side that goes through another 4 layers, because it's so important. And very often there's an inside job involved as well. So it's not just looking for suspicious looking people. It might be somebody that you're very, very familiar with. And as you say, over time, nothing happens for a whole long time. You're used to seeing the same people dealing with these artifacts and artworks. The system needs to protect the institution even from internal threats as well as external threats. So it needs to be smart, but it also, you have to really train those that are going to be using the system from the response point of view as to what to do and what to look out for. And there has to be that approval and multiple levels of approval that take place before the familiar people are even working with something without security responding to it. So they need to know, they need to be alerted even when it's the approved people that they are doing something, and they're doing it within an approved window and they do have permission. Somebody's aware of it. And of course, beyond physical theft, we're now also seeing attacks on digital memory itself. How vulnerable are museum archives, provenance databases, collection management systems to cybercrime? And are we underestimating this threat?
Yeah, they're absolutely vulnerable. And this is what we see. The concept of theft today is very different from what it was decades ago. So much more involves cyber attacks and hacking systems and phishing at a basic level, or trying to break into someone's bank account or steal credit card numbers. It feels almost quaint, the idea that someone's going to break into your house while you're on vacation and steal your DVD player. It's a very different approach. Okay, if we're dealing with unique artworks, that's a physical object that one would need to remove and account for. And that's a bit old school. In the era of NFTs, there was a brief window. This is kind of funny. Because the publishing world moves slowly, if you get a deal with the traditional press, it's probably 2 years before your book comes out. And I got excited about NFTs during the period where everyone got excited about it. And I wrote a whole book on it. And by the time the book came out, it was like a historical footnote. It's like, oh, I remember there was about 1.5 years where NFTs were a thing, and now nobody talks about them anymore. It's a case in point, because when that was a thing, then people were making digital forgeries of them or hacking accounts to release new ones or to appropriate others. And the fact that they were linked to the blockchain was not proof against illicit activity involving them. So these days, changing archives, at least digital archives, is something that we need to be aware of, because if you could break into archives and, let's say, plant something digitally that a scholar would come across by researching digitally and think is a real archival document that suggests that, I don't know, Beethoven wrote a 10th symphony, And then the 10th symphony is found, and it turns out that the provenance that suggests that it's a real thing is also forged. If it's all at a digital level, it's much easier to forge. It's harder to forge a real piece of paper that is old enough to be original and then slip it into a real archive physically. That's another level. And people do that, but it's much easier to have this digital approach. And this is one of the problems with digital only research. And I'll be honest, I pretty much do digital only research now because I live in the mountains in Slovenia and I don't have access to big archives and libraries if I were to live in London or something like that. But there's a danger that what you're coming across might not be real, because it's so much easier to slip in material into a digital archive than it would be a physical one. So we have to be aware of that the crime types change. The actual theft of fine art that's a physical object has not changed much. But the digital things we can do to facilitate theft, like falsifying its location or changing a signal in a tracking device or inserting a fake digital piece of provenance into a real archive that if you didn't go in person, you might think is actually part of the archive. This is where it can get very tricky.
Absolutely. We have to be aware that technology is not neutral, and it is another terrain where cultural power can be negotiated, but it is also a very useful tool, and I guess it can be played in both hands. Another actor that rarely gets discussed in public but has enormous backstage influence is the insurance sector. From your perspective, how much power do insurers actually hold over cultural outcomes? What gets recovered, what gets pursued, what gets prioritized?
So the main issue with art insurance is it is prohibitively expensive for almost everyone. I don't know if this is still the case, but I remember when I was teaching this, let's say 10 years ago, I used to make the point that in the entire country of Poland, there is only one artwork that is insured.
Wow.
And I used to make my students guess which one it is. I'm not going to make you guess, but it's Leonardo's Lady with an Ermine. I don't know if that's still the case. That was old news when I was first teaching this, but it's because fine art insurance is prohibitively expensive. And the owners of fine art aren't necessarily flush with cash that they can pay these huge sums to have the art insured. They might be wealthy on paper because of owning like an estate or an art collection, but it doesn't mean that they can pay 5 figures a year to insure or more, depending on how much the value of an object is. And so the main issue with fine art insurance is how relatively little of the world's art is insured. Whether that's a power issue, it becomes a power issue if an insured object is stolen. Then you can get into problems where, maybe it was stolen because it was insured, because an insurance company is more likely to pay a ransom that's a fraction of the actual value of the artwork that it's insured for, rather than wanting to let it disappear and then they have to pay the full value. Let's say Leonardo's Lady with an Ermine is insured for $100 million because that's how much its perceived value would be. Honestly, it's probably perceived value because Salvator Mundi sold for 450 million. So Lady with an Ermine, which is 100% certainly a Leonardo, maybe it would be valued at, 800 million. Do you want to pay 800 million, or do you want to pay, 1 million to the gang that stole it? And so there's a danger that thefts will take place because an object is insured or because there's a reward for it. And that might encourage crime. It also might inhibit investigation, depending on the country. You are sometimes not allowed to pay a ransom. For example, in England, you're not allowed to pay a ransom for a kidnap victim or a work of art or anything like that. It's illegal because they think that if you pay it, then it'll encourage kidnaps and art naps. Exactly. So it depends on the country you're in. There's a kind of funny example in Italy. There's a modern art museum that had some paintings stolen. And then they put out a reward for the return of the paintings. The paintings were returned. The reward was paid to someone who was, certainly related to the criminals who stole it. And then very shortly after, the exact same works were stolen again and never seen again. This is what you want to avoid if at all possible. And that's a kind of sort of silly example. But I would say the insurance, it's less powerful than you might think because it's so expensive. And I have a feeling that the insurance world would become more of a player if it was more affordable, so that more works would be insured. But then they're doing their homework and the mathematics much more delicately than I am, and it must not be worth their while to do so. So I think it's maybe less of a factor than we realize.
No, we usually end every episode with the same quick fire questions. So I'm going to submit you to this little test. So just fire away as your instinct tells you. What is a book that you recommend?
Ways of Seeing by John Berger.
Oh, and why do you recommend that?
So that's an art history book that has almost no words in it at all. It's like a visual puzzle. And this was assigned to us as an undergraduates to read. John Berger was a very renowned art historian. He specialized in mannerism, which is my favorite period. But this book is really distinctive because it literally has almost no words. And you're meant to be able to learn things from it and get things out of it by looking at pictures and reproductions of artworks that have been placed in a certain order. So it's kind of like a fun game to play, but it's also educational.
Interesting. It's not one that I know. I'm going to pick that up. I read a lot, but I haven't come across that one. The best advice you received that you still use?
Create your own career. So it's easy to fit into a pre-existing career. And if there's a pre-existing career that suits you, great. But you can also create your own by looking for gaps in some field that you're excited about. It has to be something you're passionate about and excited enough to really focus on it and have the drive to do so. But I think creating your own career or jobs is something that most people don't think to do, but is a great way forward.
That one makes me smile because when I was finished university and looking for jobs, I was doing exactly what everybody else does, going through the newspapers, seeing what was advertised. And I suddenly thought, this is not the way to do it. I'm rather going to sit in a chair with my eyes closed. And my mother said to me, what are you doing? I said, I'm looking for my ideal job. And she laughed at me. But I opened my eyes, I'd come up with it. I'd decided I wanted to be a photojournalist for World Vision. And I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And so I phoned them and asked to speak to the CEO and told him I wanted to be a photojournalist. He said, we don't have any such job at all. And I said, I know. And I then persuaded him why they needed to have it. And they made it for me and they employed me. And I absolutely loved it. They loved having me there. And from that moment on, I created my own career wherever I went. So it was a lesson I learned early, and I absolutely agree with you. One piece of professional advice that you would give your 20-year-old self?
Do what excites you each day to do. I'm lucky enough that I was doing that from, let's say, age 26. But I so enjoyed being a student that I wanted to be a student as long as possible. I kept adding degrees that were totally unnecessary and primarily decorative. But the whole thing is most of your life you spend working and you don't want to be feeling like, oh my goodness, when I wake up, I have to go to work. So do something that you would be doing for fun anyway, if at all possible. And for many people, that's not feasible. But if you're lucky enough to have choices available to you, that should be the goal, whatever that means to you.
Absolutely. And Noah, if you were an artwork, what would you be and why?
I'm used to getting the question, what's my favorite artwork or what would I steal? And I've never had this one. I'm going to say the Nike of Samothrace. That's the first thing that came, Winged Victory from the Louvre, because I think it's absolutely incredible. And it's not sort of like complicated, tortured puzzle thing that I usually like to study. So I don't think I would want to be that. And this is just pure, it was meant to be on the bow of a ship and look like the drapery has been wet from the sea spray and it's cruising towards victory. And I think that sounds pretty good.
And you are absolutely amazing. So that's a perfect match. Thank you, Noah, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Your work shows us that art crime is not an anomaly. It's a pressure map of cultural power. Who moves, who intervenes, who stays silent, what disappears. And how much of it we've discovered all reveal deeper infrastructures shaping the art world. For more of Noah's insights, you can read his extended feature in Armature issue number 3, The Hidden Infrastructures of Power. I'm Tamzin Lovell, and this has been Taller Together. See you next time.